for you. There we go. So brilliant. So it gives me great pleasure once again to introduce Dr. Chris Westoby to you all. For those of you who don't know too much about Chris, Chris is our Programme Director for the University of Hull's online creative writing MA, and of course the author of The Fear Talking, which is what we're going to be discussing and celebrating this evening. On a personal note, and I'm quite surprised that both Martin and Chris have also brought up this particular story, it's a great pleasure to be speaking with Chris on this occasion because my very own first interaction with Hull University's creative writing department was at a similar book launch, again, for Chris. So when I first came to the university to look at a master's programme that I wanted to study, Chris very kindly took me under his wing, showed me around Larkin, and then invited me to the book launch for Writing Hull, the True Tales from 16 Writers, which of course Chris was one. It feels like we've very much sort of come full circle today, and I'm very excited to be here. So welcome, Chris, and it's wonderful to sort of sit down and really have a chat with you about this book.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So I think the first thing I wanted to ask you today is that, so of course, The Fear Talking, as Martin mentioned, is the culmination of a PhD, but it's also so much more than that. It's a story that, of course, is very direct towards your teenage years and your sort of formative time. So I suppose my first question for you is, how did this book come about? What is it that inspired you to put pen to paper in the very first place?
I think that's a really difficult. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment, I reckon, because as is clear in the book, I spent the first 20 years of my life, at least more, living in complete secrecy about my condition. I've had my condition since my earliest memories. I can literally think back to when I was sort of not even in primary school yet, and I can still remember having this anxiety condition. And I spent the first, majority of my life never breathing a word of it to other people, that both through not recognizing that there was a problem, or not knowing what the problem was and that it's something that can be spoken about, but also just the intense shame and secrecy about the thing itself and not wanting to talk about it to other people. When I was starting to do sort of a creative writing degree at Hull, I think it was maybe about third year that, for whatever reason, it just started to trickle into my work. I was still writing primarily like fiction pretty much the whole time that I was there. But there's just starting to be these little elements to do with mental illness and mental health conditions and how people live with them in my work. Sometimes it'd be sort of blown out of proportion in sort of some really fantastical way in fiction. Other times it'd be quite sort of like grounded and intimate. And as Martin alluded to earlier, I went on to do the master's degree at Hull as well. And it was in the non-fiction module that I was one of our assignments that we was doing was to do with writing either sort of travel or just about place itself, and was doing it about the Hull area, and me being sort of just south of the river from Hull in Barton. That's what I chose to write about. I was writing about my hometown, about how it's changed over the years and all this kind of stuff. And it was a really happy, fun kind of piece, like, digging a bit at my hometown and all that kind of stuff. But I think as I was writing it, just this kind of like cloud started to come over it that I wasn't really aware that was happening, because I started realizing I've seen all these things so up close, these changes like building sites coming and things being completed and the changing of the seasons in certain places and this attention to detail. I was seeing these things because I couldn't ever leave Barton. My hometown, going anywhere at that age, obviously when weren't driving or anything, would mean like taking public transport or relying on a lift with my parents or something like that, which was to me just a living nightmare. And so it started to creep into what I was writing about quite unawares. And I thought I might read you the exact paragraph that this one paragraph is where the entire book ended up springing from. And I was talking about different parts of Barton. And at one point I said, but there are sections you can escape to. I learned better than most. When 17 and overwhelmed by a disorder, Barton's edges were the unclimbable fences of my enclosure. I never left. Unable to attend college, unable to face home, I walked about most of the day, most days, for a year and a half, as far from eyes as possible. And I didn't really think much that I'd put that into the piece. I thought it was just kind of a bit of an explanation as to why I always sort of saw these places in Barton. And then when we did the launch event where I met yourself, Ed, for the book that it was a contributing chapter to, it was after that that a few of us met around sort of a table in the bar on campus. And that's when someone said, like, what did you mean by that? Like when you said about that thing about not being able to leave Barton. And that was it. I just started, I just realized without knowing I'd broken that ice that had lasted for so many years of not being able to ever, especially not just tell, you know, like colleagues and friends that I knew at university. And all of a sudden it was happening. And obviously the world didn't end. And I think it just started to snowball from then. Martin was starting to say, you know, this is a really cool story and it's actually something that has grounds for a PhD if you ever felt like doing that. While I was doing the PhD for the first year or so, I was so convinced that this wasn't a story worth telling. I thought, oh, I can maybe contribute a chapter to my thesis, maybe about my experiences. It'll be 2,000 words. I'll just sort of, you know, don't get in and out before anybody gets bored. But the more and more people who were reading it, the more they were saying, this is really interesting. You need to sort of stop rushing to get out of here. You need to put more of this in. And it was just growing. And so from then it was quite natural about how the book came about. It just grew and grew and grew. The whole project of the fear talking, eventually when I gave myself up and said, right, okay, clearly I'm just writing a book about my own experiences at this point. I thought it was going to cover from being the ages of 16 to 25. And as it just expanded and expanded, I realized that I got to the length of a book and I'd only covered 2 years. I'd only covered between 16 and 18. So that's when I thought, crap, I'd better kind of tie a bow on this one and start to kind of acknowledge that perhaps this is going to be an extended project in order to sort of have the development of the mental health that, you know, that I became so invested in showing its natural kind of progression and building and stuff that I knew it needed more. So yeah, I realized that there was a story in itself about those 2 years of further education and about the impact that it had at that particular time. And there was an arc that just presented itself as I was writing it that I didn't realize was there. It's not the arc of the anxiety or the OCD itself. It's the arc of the conflict with the people who I know and love and the people around me, because of a lack of understanding from each other and this lack of communication, moving into sort of starting to find a voice and starting to be able to talk about it. So the two exist in harmony, really. The book is about sort of like starting to be able to communicate and the doors that opens and what it manages to do when that starts to happen. But also it was happening in real life. The book was helping me to do that in real life as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting response to it. I think I was really struck by the way you were speaking about a lot of the terms there. You used to phrases like edges, and then moving on when you sort of talked about how the journey developed, you start talking about opening doors and sort of things expanding on further. I wonder if that idea of sort of the freedom that this book has offered you has been sort of a part of this journey, if it's been something that perhaps you've been consciously aware of, or just sort of an ever-growing part of the project as it's been moving forwards.
Do you mean the freedom to talk about it?
Yeah, the freedom to talk about, to express yourself, and to sort of, you know, get the words on page. If that sort of gives you that sense of freedom, I suppose.
Yeah, I think one thing I think is that the condition itself revels in secrecy. I think anxiety and OCD as well. What I always sort of say is that they don't attach themselves. The blackmail they hold you ransom to, they don't attach themselves to necessarily noble fears like you know, I'm afraid of I can't think of something that would actually be that's legitimately scary off the top of my head. Instead it attaches to something that's really, that you think that everyone else would think was silly, that everyone else would think was ridiculous, that everyone else would think it wants you to like not be able to speak about it at all. So my fears that this all attaches to do with sort of the public humiliation that that kind of manifests itself as a fear of being violently ill in front of other people, make sure it makes sure that it's too embarrassing for me to tell people about, especially in detail. So for me, the freedom was saying screw you to that. saying like, you're trying to hold me to ransom and not speak about this kind of thing, and that makes it worse. That is treading you down all the time. The fact that it's forcing you to suffer it on your own, suffer it silently. And so writing the book was offering that freedom, as in, you're starting to disclose this, but you're doing it on your own terms. I could never, at the age I started writing this book, just suddenly sort of get up in front of a load of people and just sort of, I don't know why a crowd would gather for this, but just suddenly announce everything that's wrong with me and everything that I think about and everything that I suffer. Instead, you can drip feed it. You're doing it in your own terms. You're writing it down. You're thinking, no one's like, I'm never going to let anybody see this. And then you think, okay, so then you're writing it down just for yourself and for your own purposes, but then you might start showing little bits to different people and stuff like that. So I think there's a great freedom in how you choose to open those doors, how do you choose to open the floodgates, because it's already there. And now I almost feel like I can, if I sort of like went to a new group of people or a job or something like that, rather than try and explain that there's this sort of certain thing about me that might make life difficult, I could be just like, do you guys mind reading this before like we carry on, because it's sort of all in there instead. So it offers that kind of freedom.
Excellent. That's fantastic. You've got sort of a backstory primer just in your bag to hand out to people when you meet new people. I think that's brilliant. I think one of the bits you were talking about there that I thought was really fascinating, you talked about this idea of no longer sort of feeling like you're on your own, I suppose. Obviously, whilst writing a book, it can feel quite a solitary exercise. You spend a lot of time by yourself in front of a word processor or a notepad. But when you sort of publish this book out and people start reading it, you start perhaps creating these relationships between the book and these prospective readers. And I wondered if you had sort of an expected audience in mind when you were writing this book, sort of, who is this book really written for?
Yeah. I think I don't like to say that the typical thing where I say it's sort of for everybody, but what I did try to write is a book for people, for kind of different angles that you could be looking at it from, and so therefore different people and different people's relationships with something like anxiety. It's firstly just blanket for anybody who wants to know more about it. The whole idea is it's not telling you about anxiety. It's not telling you this is what happens when you're anxious. This is the history of it. This is the science of it, etc. Like sort of so many books that I've read do. It's just it's a completely open looking behind the curtain of someone else's life, the thoughts and everything else. And that's how I want people to learn about about this condition, by observing it and by perhaps making their own diagnoses, their own kind of thoughts about it without that being force-fed to them. The primary people who I suppose I was thinking about whilst writing it is, as Martin said, is people who are like me. When I was 16 or younger, or way up until I was like starting to do the PhD and stuff, and I didn't know that any such voices existed who were experiencing similar things to me. And even when I would read books that were to do with anxiety, I would sometimes wish to hear more from the person themselves and their own experiences, rather than talking about it in this more sterile way, or talking about their own experiences with this kind of gift of hindsight, saying this is what I was doing when I was 16. It's because I had this condition, and it's because I was sort of experiencing these symptoms, etc. And I just didn't feel like that would be helpful to me at that age. I didn't want to hear about the condition. I wanted to just listen to someone else who had it, so I could start to sort of see the similarities and think, Christ, yeah, I think like that, or I have a different fear, but I do similar things to kind of try and alleviate it, and have that kind of it's a cold comfort. I know, this sort of sense of camaraderie, rather than sort of this is a book of how to fix anxiety and stuff. But I don't think, in my case at least, it can be fixed. It just is. So I think just hearing someone else talk about it, and again, it's on your own terms. You can pick up the book, you can put it down anytime you want, is what I wanted. But then the third, and again, sort of perhaps just equally important, absolutely equally important, is it's for people who live with or know somebody who have a condition comparable to mine. Because I find that even if you're really, really open with someone and you have a great relationship and you sort of talk about nearly everything, I still would sort of go as far as to guess that for many people, they wouldn't quite go into the detail that the book does, and into the sort of the gruesome details of thoughts, and the details of how it affects you physiologically, and the things you do behind closed doors when other people aren't looking, and the behavior that you have, and the reasons that you have for the behavior, and the feelings that you have in terms of sort of regret about how you interact with people, and the hopes you have, and everything like that. It's almost so I want that to help people who know someone with anxiety, or care for someone with anxiety, or live with someone, etc., to hopefully be able to read it and sort of better understand some of the processes, and better understand kind of a day in the life of, you know, of what it's like for someone else to do that. So it's those three pillars. It's for sort of any sort of zooming in, I suppose, anybody who wants to know more about it, or just wants to sort of join in that kind of dialogue about mental health that's thankfully slowly gaining momentum. Anybody who knows somebody who has any experience of this kind of condition, and also if you experience it yourself, that you can hear sort of a kindred spirit.
Brilliant. I think that sort of experiential nature of this book is one of the things that really struck me as I was reading through it. Now, of course, I know we're sort of a fairly similar age, so a lot of the references that you made to sort of things you did in your teenage years, I did that too. I could feel very much that sort of kindred spirit with the character that I was reading about, and it very much helped me to sort of go back into my own teenage years. I think there is that lovely experiential sort of almost universality to the honesty, I think, that sort of really underpins this book. I think it's really right ahead. You have a reading for us that perhaps really expresses that that particular experiential nature of things.
Yeah, there's a couple readings I put aside for sort of different reasons in terms of what I was sort of like going to be talking about. And I think this first one, I suppose, is speaking about the book sort of being for other people as well, is this is early on in the book, as you can see, and it is this is an example of how the book isn't just to do with myself and my own feelings and my own experiences and stuff. It's also about the people who it affects, and the people who were caught in the sort of the gravitational field of the mental health that I had. And this is the example of when it would hurt other people. When I was 16, I was in my first serious relationship, and you know, when you have a condition like this, it's important to know that you're not the only one who suffers. The people around you suffer as well. And this particular extract is detailing my inability to go around to my friend's house on a Friday night, simply because I knew that my girlfriend at the time was going there. Ben invites us all to go round to his on a Friday night, but I'm too nervous to go. It's the first time I've backed out of something taking place so close by, barely a 10-minute walk away. Emma's going there. That's why. I can't disappear if I'm ill without her following me home, without then untangling myself from her, having to be subtle, waiting until it would no longer seem rude to ask when she's leaving, whilst inwardly screaming to be alone. But at about 9:30, there's a knock at my front door that I recognise, and my insides fall to bits. I come downstairs and see the wobbly little portrait through the obscured glass, open the door to Emma's big smile. Thought I'd leave early and surprise you, she says. She sees my face. It sticks a pin into her happy expression. I stand back from the door to let her in. She lowers her head and goes past me. I sit at the kitchen table and she sits adjacent to me. I walked up with Ryan as far as his house. There wasn't much going on at Ben's. It wasn't the same without you there. Got to snaffle some cheesy chips off Holly though. Just thought I'd come here for a bit. I don't reply. Didn't you want me to come? I shake my head. It's very hard to talk. Sickness licks up my stomach. There's an aching spin behind my eyes. Beads of tree sap form down the walls of my throat, sticking it together when I swallow. How could she just show up? The one place I feel safe in this world, and she breaks in to surprise me? Emma falls quiet. She looks around, palms together between her thighs. I thought you might be happy I came to see you. I put my 2 thumbnails together and press them so that the skin beneath them goes pale. Bite off the skin beside the nail, twist my fingers to make the joints click. I'll text Mum, Emma says. I nod and watch her do it. Wait for the reply. She says she'll be 10 minutes. She's just finishing her tea. I do a big exhale with inflated cheeks and don't say another word whilst we wait. My brother Jordan comes in to get a drink and he sees us. His eyebrows pinched together and his mouth turns down, bottom lip rolled out. Am I interrupting something? He pours himself some milk, takes a bag of Doritos from the cupboard and leaves. I shouldn't have come, Emma says to the table. I watch the oven clock blink away 5 slow, silent minutes. I managed to run my fingers over Emma's hand because a normal person wouldn't be furious. She's tried to be impulsive and nice. I want her to know I don't hate her. She looks up at me, but I focus on her hand, how the soft skin gathered at her knuckles moves a little with my sweeping finger, and I can feel the bone. After she leaves, I send a text. I need you to promise me something. Sure, what? She replies. That you'll never come round again without me saying that you can.
An excellent reading, Chris. I think one of the shames of this digital format is that we can't hear the applause that I'm sure would follow that. If you'd like to clap, there is a reactions button at the bottom of the screen, which has a little sort of clap icon that you can click on if you'd like to sort of signify your approval. But I think the reading itself and the text underneath that reading really express that sort of that emotion that really underpins this piece, and the way that you work with it to allow the reader to, so like you were saying earlier, to sort of get a hand, like it's to get an insight perhaps into that personal experience. I think emotion can be something very difficult to write about. I think as you've just shown through that reading, it's something you've handled with sort of really, really intense care in this particular piece.
Yeah, I'm aware that I'm aware that in many parts of the book, and this is a prime example, that I just don't come across very well at all. I come across as cold and as mean. And I knew that whilst writing it as well, because this is it's the unreasonable expectation, I suppose, as hard as you try not to, you unreasonably expect that others will hopefully understand your behaviours and thoughts. You know, there was my relationship with Emma, there was my parents, all these people who were close to me who had to somehow know how I worked without any input from me. And it was impossible for me to give them that input because of, like I said, me not understanding it myself and me not being able to talk about it. It was all guesswork. And so, you know, people would sometimes try to do really nice things. People would try to be supportive. People would try to suggest things that would, to any normal person, be really nice. And they'd get this negative reaction from me, like in this case, just somebody impulsively coming to see me, which is normally a really nice surprise, is instead like my worst nightmare. I think in that whole extract, I don't think I say anything at all. I'm so on the verge of vomiting that I'm just kind of shaking my head and like nodding and stuff. Like, so yeah, there's kind of two sides of suffering that this kind of causes.
I think that's really interesting. I think I'd like to stay with that idea of sort of, as you said, you feel like at times, 16-year-old Chris, the narrator, doesn't come across, you know, nicely, as you put it. And of course, you're dealing with a lot of other people as well. Emma is a real person who is now sort of in this book. And I thought that would be a really interesting thing to perhaps ask you about a little bit more. What was it like sort of writing about your own life? You know, did you ever feel the urge to sort of self-censor or censor moments or hide bits from people because you knew you didn't come across as well as you'd have liked, or something like that?
Oh, so many times I wanted to self-censor, and I think I wrote down the first draft, eventually sort of just letting go and just being able to write down anything, just splurging, and absolutely everything went in there. It was massive, and I just thought I wanted to treat everything with the same kind of sort of honesty at once. So there's the honesty about me. There's the honesty about what I felt about other people. There's that kind of thing where I might be saying negative things about people who I now think really highly of. And there's also the sour thing of writing really nice things about people who turned out not to be so great. And I hate that, as I often say in one of my lectures, to quote a fantastic book about writing from life, is that it's a rigged game. You know, it doesn't matter. You see these like the blurbs of books where people open up about things like this and they say it's brave and it's written this way and that way. But at the end of the day, the author does have the choice to do that. It's the author's choice to write those words on the page. So there's an element of control, even if, like me, you're trying to sort of wince whilst writing something that's really, and you just don't want anybody to know. But the people in the book don't get that choice. They're in there sort of whether they want to be or not, unless it becomes this kind of focus group book where you're sort of asking everybody sort of how they want to be portrayed in the book. And there was I think the filter that I ended up applying to it in terms of self-censoring was with all the bits that I worried would upset people, I worried would make me look awful, I worried would be sharing too much or anything like that was like a difficult thing to get past. I would ask it the same question that I suppose you ask any piece of writing that you're editing: is it necessary? Is the detail of this person saying this certain thing, or is your thoughts on this person or disclosing this certain information, is it actually doing something? Is it either informing people more to do with like you and hence the mental health thing, or is it pushing the story forward? And if it wasn't doing either of those things, that's when they'd go. But that sadly did leave a lot of stuff that I was very uncomfortable about sharing and very conscious of the damage that it was still in there. And I think one of my main reasons for defending some of the things that I thought, for example, like some of the judgmental thoughts that I had back then and the things that I used to think that I don't think now, that I'm scared of people thinking that that's me today, and not this kind of younger and more ignorant person, is as the book develops into the second half, it becomes very, very focused on OCD. And my OCD, both in this book and then it only crescendos even more afterwards, really, is it gets more and more of a censoring of my own thoughts. I start to think things and think I shouldn't think that. I start to think things and think because I think that I'm bad and these bad things are going to happen. So I'm trying to cancel my thoughts. I'm trying to say, stop thinking that, stop. And obviously that's the hardest thing to do, to stop thinking it. I start writing texts and then deleting them because I think there's something wrong with that. And I start thinking before I speak to, am I allowed to say that? In terms of the rules of my obsession, am I allowed to say these things? So I thought, if I don't open up everything that I thought back then, it would be a disservice to people who are trying to learn more about this condition, because they won't sort of see the full picture, they won't get the absolute full deal. But B, if I start to censor the thoughts that I thought back then, all I'm doing is the exact same thing that I do to myself in real life. And I'm sort of saying that those thoughts were wrong and I shouldn't have had those thoughts. And the whole idea that I'm trying to say in this book is that that's not the case. That, that anybody who has any experience with like intrusive thoughts or obsession and stuff will have been told that you shouldn't appraise thoughts that way. You shouldn't sort of assign them good and bad. You shouldn't say that you're a bad person or whatever for thinking these certain things. So I've tried to apply that mentality to the book, that as long as it's prudent to the story itself or to people understanding more about it, it shouldn't be censored. No matter how many sleepless nights I've literally had since, I don't know, whenever I sort of finished writing it, Martin, like in 2017, 2018, when the first, and that's when I started, I never really thought about it too much. And then suddenly you wake up in the dead of the night and you think, shit, people are going to read this. Like the people in this book are going to read this. And it's very, very, very scary. I haven't slept much these last fortnight leading up to the book. I'm dreading hearing from some of the people who are in it as well. I'm just going to have to sort of try and talk to them about it. I don't know how I'm going to handle that.
And that's why phones have that option for you to turn the ringer off, right? That can be under the pillow. We can deal with that later.
Yeah, I could just turn all the lights out in the house and pretend I don't live here anymore.
Brilliant. I think what I was very struck by when you were just speaking was sort of that when you were talking about the way that your sort of the mental health elements sort of grow and change, especially, you know, throughout the book, but of course in your life as well. And I was wondering, yes, of course, if you don't mind sort of sharing this with us, how the process of writing this book, or how having this book out there, has sort of impacted on your sort of your mental health. You know, in what sort of ways do you now feel perhaps different to 16-year-old Chris, 18-year-old Chris, the narrator that we meet in The Fear Talking?
Yeah. So the writing of the book is a tough one, really, because I mean, like I started the PhD in 2013, and then the book in earnest, I suppose, maybe 2014, 15 is when it sort of started to be what it would become. And between then and finishing the book in sort of 2019 sort of time, my mental health was going downhill like the whole time. I was already had all these sort of problems, and it was just getting worse and worse and worse. I was becoming more anxious. I was struggling to do more and more. I was reacting to stressful situations worse and worse. And on the surface, I think I was still seeming like I was keeping it together, but I was spending longer and longer to get ready to do things. I would like go and teach at the university as a guest or something, and I would have not eaten for at least a solid 24 hours or more before then. And often, like the days leading up to it, I'd have like a little rice cracker a day or something. I'd literally be starving nearly, but I wouldn't feel it because I was too anxious to feel hungry. And I was self-medicating as well as all the other meds that I was on for it. And I was doing obsessive routines that were taking longer and longer and longer before I could leave the door or open the door to let someone else in or whatever it was, that was becoming over 4 hours sort of time. I was waking up. I've had, you know, job interviews where I've woken up at 2:30 in the morning so that I'm ready to leave at 7 or whatever it is, just to go there and stuff like that. And so people were asking me while I was writing this book, are you just sort of abusing yourself by writing this? Is it just making you worse to write this? And my answer was always, I would have gotten worse either way. Like because people were saying, you know, you go into work or whatever it is you're doing, you're anxious all day, you're anxious about coming home, you're anxious about the weekend, you're anxious about the evening, like you're terrified when you're there, and you're always ill and you're always starving and all this kind of stuff. And then the one time when you actually come home and you're meant to be feeling safe and relaxed, you're opening your laptop and you're writing about anxiety, sort of like you're not giving yourself 2 seconds breath from it, and you're returning to a time when you was really struggling with it. But my answer was always like, well, it don't work like that. If I wasn't writing about it, I wasn't just going to go home and forget about it. Like there is no hour that passes really that you then, you know, look back and think, oh, I haven't thought of, you know, this thing I'm afraid of in a few hours now. That's funny. It's there anyway. It doesn't matter if I was writing the book or if I was out doing something else or just sort of relaxing at home. It's there. It's always there. So I don't think it affected it. You know, my mental health got worse whilst I was writing it. But like I said earlier on in this, like the tremendous benefit it had was that the fact that it was unlocking that ability to speak about it, and which was like getting better and better and better. I went from complete secrecy to being able to talk to Martin about it, to being able to start sort of showing a couple of other people. People would start saying, you know, at the pub, like, what is it you're writing about anyway in this course you do? And I'd be like, oh, it's about, you know, mental illness and it's based on myself. At first I used to say it was mental illness and it was fiction because I couldn't quite bring myself to say that, but then I would sort of eventually say it was about myself. So it was like opening until eventually I was like doing talks about it at university, and I was, you know, completely like I'd just smashed the secrecy to pieces. And I think that the book was all to do with that. So I do think it had a great help, even though on the surface I was getting worse. It did so much to help me.
Excellent. I think on that topic of sort of smashing the secrecy and being open about these topics, and that takes us nicely into our next reading of the sort of next section of the book.
Absolutely. Again, similarly, this is right towards the start of the book, in the 9th chapter, and this was kind of it's sort of the progression. It is basically when I was at the very start of college, I was like managing to make it into college, but I was starting to take the odd day off, and I was starting to have to go home early, and I was starting to be at college but not in the lessons itself. And I started to become this kind of entertainment figure because we had like a canteen at the college called the Maggie May, where people would sort of congregate when you had like a free period. And I was just there all day, sort of drawing, just with my head down, like, and people were sort of saying, do you not have a lesson yet, sort of thing, when they'd like come back from another lesson, they'd see that I was still there, for example. And this is an example of that and sort of why it was I was having to do it. My drawings in the Maggie May become a form of light entertainment of friends to check in on between lessons. I love using biro, the tiny precision strokes, the slow deepening of blacks as the layers are added. My head gets right down near the paper, back arched, fringe tickling my hand. I can fall into the detail, concentrating enough to quiet my need to flee college, just a little bit, just for a moment or two. It can take the edge off. Drawing gives me space to think about distances between here and the bus stop, from the bus stop to home. I think about travel time between now and the bus, now and home, between the areas of invisibility, because there may be nowhere to hide on the bus, but beside the back roads are places I could disappear, like hedgerows, like naked now the leaves have fallen, but enough to obscure my identity to passers-by, ridges and ditches, garden walls and evergreen trees. But between these things are the wretched open fields and the busy streets in Scunthorpe. Just try to concentrate on the shading of this tree. Don't vomit right here on a high table. Lessons are getting harder to show up to. I'm forever on the verge of hurling. Recurring daydreams haunt me, shape-shifting and undefined, like that old Walking in the Air video done with squiggly crayon, of sprinting away from wherever I'm sat, coughing hot sick across clean clothes and carpet. I set timers on my phone that count down to 5 minutes after a lesson ends. No idea why this helps. Scrutinize the layout of every classroom, distance between me and the door, number of people to maneuver past should I have to leave, how many face me where I'm sat and how many would face me if I made my way out, number of people full stop, classroom density, you know? Is the teacher the understanding sort, or would he or she make a scene if I tried to go? All situations have an extremely strong vibe. Dense classrooms feel like cauliflower hearts, and sparse, easy to leave classrooms feel like pushing empty bottles through the bristled hole of a recycled bin. Sometimes it feels like music or a film. To try and distract myself from the reel of images getting louder behind my eyes, I draw patterns down the margins of my notebooks. Kites and grids, tentacles and branches, spikes, blocks and blobs all entwined. I decide a point of light and start shading. After 3 warnings, one teacher threatens to make me leave if I continue, which in college is pretty embarrassing. I am listening though, I whisper. My stomach doesn't jettison buttered toast and polos, but if I speak another word, it will. Class ends, and I walk all the way out of Scunthorpe, down a farmer's track, over a little motorway bridge and towards the M18. Clumps of mud stick to my shoes, and even though it's December, I sweat. Now what?
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Another fantastic reading there. And again, another insight into the narrative, the character, the individual that you perhaps were, and this experience you've shared with us. I think this would be a fantastic time to start opening the floor out to some questions. And I did get one question emailed in beforehand that I'll happily ask you on behalf of, I believe it's from one of your students, Chris. But if you do have any questions, please use this time to sort of type them in the chat or to sort of raise your hand if you'd like to ask something to Chris yourself. So the first question I have for you is, why in nearly every story about mental illness do they either get better or gain some kind of control, turn it into something more positive? For many, even most, it doesn't happen like that. Does that really send out a good message to all of those who can't escape their mental illness, to see another survivor benevolently tell us how much their illness has made them grow, that we can supposedly use as to grow? Now that's a sort of a starting quotation, which again, I believe is from one of your lectures, Chris.
It's turning one of my own lectures against me. This is like one of the best first questions I think could have come about. I sort of saw it and thought, Damn, I'm going to have to pass that on because it's a really good question, but I may need a minute to.
Well, this was the second part, if you like, to give you some of that thinking time. We've got, it says, I had a therapist caution me that my demons would never disappear, that I would never be able to control them, but I could learn to master or live with them more effectively. Mastery, he claimed, is different than control and involves a kind of acceptance, awareness, and developing of tools to deal with things better. Does this resonate in any way, or is it another form of turning your illness into something positive?
Yeah. I think for a start, if you do turn your illness into something positive, then fantastic. What I'm saying in the quote is that I think the multitude of those types of stories that are currently out there, every sort of like mental health story that you seem to pick up and buy, always has like a positive note at the end, a positive ending. There's always kind of, this is the story of how I got better. This is the story of how, despite having the illness, I managed to sort of find a good thing, I managed to get something good out of it. I also had a therapist. The third, I think one of the third or fourth round of therapy I had was acceptance commitment therapy, and that one of the first things that therapist said to me, because whenever you start therapy, they'll always sort of say, what is it you want from this? And I would always say, I want to be better. I want to not have this anymore. I want to have a good, good life. And the third therapist was the first one to say, well, tough, because you're not going to get better. The sooner you accept that you're not going to get better, the sooner you can actually start clawing a bit of quality of life better. You need to stop trying to be cured and fixed and normal, which are all these terms that should have massive inverted commas around them. Instead, your goal should be to have a good quality of life. And sort of like, that's what we're going to work on, having a good quality of life in spite of the things that you go through. Mastery, I'm trying to remember the rest of the question. I think if it's in terms of, is this book another form of turning it into something positive, that's something I really don't know the answer for, because I don't quite yet know whether it is going to be something positive. I've found many positive elements in it, but it certainly isn't mastery of it at all. I suppose I've managed to lay to rest a part of this kind of illness, because I used to think about these years all the time, and I suppose I was quite stuck in the past. I would always be comparing myself to how I was back then and comparing my condition now to how it was back then. But I think writing about it, if there is something that's really positive, I suppose, is that I've kind of stopped thinking about that time now, because writing about it is externalizing it, and to edit something is to sort of mold and play with your own experiences and make them your own. So I think there is a form of mastery in that, because you've sort of said, I'm going to contain and take control of and do with what I want to the past experiences that I've got. In my case, to the illness that I've got. So even if it hasn't changed, how things are now, there is something you can do with the past.
Brilliant. I think that's a very good answer, and I quite like the sort of, I don't know exactly what the sort of long-term answer to that question is. The idea of sort of writing is not necessarily to provide questions; it's to sort of to provide answers, but is instead to offer questions, both for your readers and perhaps for ourselves. That's a fantastic response. I've had a couple more questions in the chats. This one is from Judith. It says, Chris, I'd like to know what the people who were included in the book thought about it. Has it helped them understand what happened at that time in your life?
I should also say Judith was my other supervisor for this, so she's read the book and knows it very intimately. And this is a really good question. Yes, a lot of people have read it now, including my brothers, my parents, in fact, one of my parents, and Emma as well have read it. So preemptive to the book coming out, I tried to circulate it around the people who were in it the most and would potentially sort of take issue with sort of the content of it. Whether it has, and I'm going to scroll up and see the question. What they thought about it, I think, was a mixed. Pretty much everybody who read it understood why I'd written what I'd written. Like, I don't think anybody sort of completely said this is unnecessarily open, this is unnecessarily too much about it. I think the people who were in the limelight the most, and the people who have the most reason to be upset about it, are my parents and Emma. It was very upsetting to my parents, understandably, because not only, I suppose, do they fear that this might put them in a bad light, which I'd hope it absolutely doesn't, and anybody else who's read it has said so, but I can totally understand why it would seem that way. It's also learning things about me, the things I did, the things I hid from them back when I was that age, which, even if it's a long time ago, I don't think makes it any less painful to read. So they have struggled a lot to sort of get through it, as supportive as they are for it and for what I'm trying to do and the reason for it and such like. I think it's just a very, very, very hard thing for a parent to read, and I can totally understand that. For Emma, it was again, she completely is on board with and understands and supports and kind of champions this kind of book and what it's trying to do and the reasons for the openness and such like. I think in her case, it confirmed, I think the painful thing was that it confirmed a lot of things that I think she already knew, which perhaps she hoped she was wrong about, in terms of what I thought, the things that I thought about her, things I thought about our relationship, some of the reasons of my avoidance. And with her as well, it was a completely secretive, I didn't let her in, I never did. Throughout this book, many people who have read this, they say it about my parents, and they also say about Emma, that she is the kind of the hero of the book, really, because throughout the whole thing, I am constantly not giving her enough credit, either as a caring person who wants to support me, and I'm not letting her because I just can't let someone in, but also someone who knows more than I think. Throughout the entire book, a book about anxiety, the word anxiety, I think, is only mentioned once, and the only person to mention it is Emma, who tries to give me a sort of like a pamphlet to do with panic and anxiety in the hope that I might get help, and I completely sort of throw it in her face, and I completely underestimate how much she knows about it. So it's my hope that these people sort of feel like they've been represented in a way that sort of, I suppose, throws me in a far worse light than them. But I suppose, yeah, in answer to your question, Judith, it's been a mixed bag.
Excellent. I think that that opportunity to understand can be quite a rare thing. So I think the ability to open the book and perhaps get into those pages is something very curious to think about as well. I've had a couple more questions. So this one is from Nikki. It's got, Chris, since this book was born from your PhD, you must have done an exegesis about it. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that? How did you frame it, or how did you approach it in your research, for example?
That's a good question. Man, my exegesis almost seems like a bad memory now. I think the exegesis came, it all grew from the reading, because the reading is what informs the book. I spent the first kind of year and a half, I think, reading both other non-fiction authors and fiction authors who have approached subjects like this. And I read lots of journals, sort of more towards the medical field, of people who sort of have either empirical evidence or sort of reviews of evidence to do with anxiety, OCD, depression, and other things as well. I was sort of looking into anything that sort of any mental health condition that kind of included intrusive thought. That was the kind of the overarching thing. And so I'd say my exegesis all grew from that. It all grew from what I was taking away from that experience and how it was informing my reading. Because I think the more that I was reading, what I was starting to see were the gaps, and what people weren't doing and what people weren't doing enough of. And sort of I started realizing how, the thing that I was originally writing had already been done so many times before, and there was certain things I thought that kind of field was lacking in terms of what people had done before. So I think the exegesis kind of catalogues that. It's a journey of that. That's at least how it kicks off, and it's obviously as well the process of how it was edited down, the different steps it took. It was me thinking about the ethics as well, like I've been speaking about tonight, talking about the ethics of writing about other people, the other people who were all part of the kind of the journey that I went on. Man, I'm struggling to remember some parts of it. I think if you're interested in the exegesis, I'm more than happy to send it to you, rather than me try to rattle off what it is that I wrote. If that'd be helpful.
That's a very kind offer. Excellent. Thank you. So I'll move on to the next question. This one is from Ali. It says, Chris, you said that you found a freedom in writing this book and that you could at least share your experience with the illness. I'm wondering to what extent your sense of freedom began to show in the narrative voice you used in the novel, i.e. is there a freedom in the writing style that you found?
I think as with any book, and I think all the writers among us will know this feeling, is the more you write, especially an extended piece of work, you sometimes find it's after several sort of 1,000 words or even quite deep into the book that you realize the voice has clicked and you've kind of like settled on it. When I first started writing, I was ping-ponging between either being really kind of analytical and really quite sort of saying how the condition is and stuff, or being like really overly kind of overly vulgar, and as Martin would often call it, Bartonian, sort of the way that like we'd sort of talk with my mates and stuff like that. And I think the two of them, swinging between them for a start, was kind of quite jarring to the reader. But also I think one or the other was quite hard to have for the whole duration of like a book length project. So I was starting to try and find a bit of a middle ground. I was thinking I want to have that rough and sort of like boyish and quite ignorant and quite brass kind of like way that I spoke back then, and way people in Barton spoke, and the way that I suppose my inner monologues were going. But at the same time, just pare it back enough for it not to just be a onslaught of swear words, which it would have been, or an onslaught of kind of that kind of harder to connect with voice. Because I think my inner monologue wasn't quite as like that. My inner monologue was frightened. It was trying to be analytical, trying to sort of think about things in this obsessive way, like the extract that I read a minute ago. So I think there was a lot of freedom once I found that click of, yes, this is how I feel like this is how I would speak, and this is how I thought when I was 16 years old. And it was quite, despite the subject matter being really intense and difficult, I would look forward to coming back to the laptop and returning to that time. I don't know if it's like a nostalgic thing or kind of reconciling with the way that you used to be or something like that. But I really did start to feel like I was like, I'd unlocked that little sort of portal to be able to sort of think and write and speak the way that I used to. So I think that's when the freedom that you mentioned, Ali, that's when I sort of like cottoned on with it and really connected with it.
Interesting. Thanks, Chris. That's a great answer, talking about sort of refinding one's own voice that the sort of the narrative is written. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. We've got a comment here from Trisha. It says, I applaud your efforts to show what it feels like and sharing your thought process. My daughter began displaying signs of personality disorder at age 14, and no one in the education system knew anything about it. There was no point of reference for them either. Please share this with schools everywhere and to teachers, etc.
Oh, that's fantastic. I hope it's useful to you, Trisha. That the point of reference, I think, is a really strong point, and that is something that I think is desperately needed. Something to sort of like hear that there's a, for either yourself as knowing someone who has this, or the person themselves, just to hear other voices.
Excellent. I have another question here from Robin. It says, what do you think about the vast amounts of information we now have about mental illnesses? Is it helpful or too much for someone trying to find out about what they have? Would it have helped you and your experiences where you were younger, or hinder them?
I can tell you about my experience when I was about 23, and I started looking at sort of forums and sort of, those dreaded kind of websites that you type in your symptoms and like tells you you're going to die tomorrow sort of thing online. And to me, it was an overload. I don't think it would have helped. I think in something like a forum, many sort of very distressed people can wind up there, sort of all communicating with each other at once. And I think for some, obviously it's completely down to the individual, because some people might gain a lot of strength from hearing those kind of things. But I think to me, who I was on a downward path, and I could sort of see the future of where I was headed. And then I was reading a barrage of accounts of people who were sort of either sort of similar to me, maybe not quite as bad as me, some of the people who were worse, who were having worse symptoms, whose symptoms had gone sort of to an extreme that I could see mine heading in the direction of. So obviously that sounds like a paradox, because then you'll think, well, okay, then why have you written a whole book about it? I think the idea is that I would prefer one voice at a time. If I could speak to one of those people at a time and they could sort of tell me about their experiences, then I might sort of feel like, oh, this is so good to hear about someone else. And not only about the worst things, but also just about the life surrounding it as well. Whereas I think online especially there's misinformation. There are cultures to do with mental health as well. There are actually some cultures that will kind of keep you out and sort of say that you're not anxious enough, you're not obsessive enough, you're not depressed enough to be a part of us. So there's this, like, which can again just knock you down even worse. There's some sort of communities that kind of glorify whatever mental illness it is, and so then you might feel like you don't want to not have it anymore. I think there's many great places out there that you can find a real sense of community and learn more about it in a really safe way. But I just think there are so many landmines that if I knew someone who was younger and was at school or something at like my sort of age, and they said, what do you think I should do? Do you think I should just start trawling the kind of the information online and the forums and stuff? I would just say to be very, very careful. And I suppose as soon as you start to recognize that it's not helping you, to make sure you sort of you pull yourself away from it. Because I think personally, I found that really distressing. Whereas when I would sort of read one person's account or talk to one person at a time, I felt like it was manageable and I was gaining more from it.
Thank you, Chris. We have another question. This one is from Matt. It says, hi, Chris. First off, I'm really pleased for you and proud to see you reach this point. You completely deserve it. I remember you teaching us about nonfiction and writing from life. One thing that came up was the nature of nonfiction or creative nonfiction and the gaps that form between remembered experiences. I'm curious how you filled those gaps in your narrative. Considering it's set over such long periods, did you dip into journals or diaries from back then?
I didn't start writing a journal till I was 18. So just literally about a month after this book finishes, there would have been plenty of journals to sort of draw from. Mine actually, I didn't have really, I think I've got some like photos on my laptop that I think I would see from, there's sections in the book when I sort of like start doing these laps around Barton and stuff, and I would be sort of, you know, I actually had pictures from that time, and that would be really good to help me remember certain scenes, because obviously Barton has changed in that sort of like 10 years since then. But a lot of it was, again, I just think this always sounds a really stupid answer, but it is true. That you remember what to write just by starting to write. I started writing patches, and if I couldn't remember the gap, I wouldn't just strain to try and remember it. I would instead just move on and leave sort of like some asterisks and then carry on writing the next bit. And I would just find myself either remembering more there as I'm writing, or while I was kind of digesting it, because I like worked in a manual labor in a workshop to sort of fund the PhD, and it was really useful in some ways, because I'd be there and I'd just suddenly sort of think, I sort of remember a detail or something somebody once said to me, and I would sort of type it on my phone and remember to put it in later on when I got home at night. And I just think that process sounds really simple, but if you can picture that process happening over several years, you end up remembering more about a time than you ever would have thought. Because like I said, I thought I'd only have a couple of thousand words and then I'd be done, because I wouldn't be able to remember anymore. But it just grows. It just does. The more time that you spend with it. I always advocate that it's a perfectly legitimate way to handle nonfiction, is if you have to address gaps either through further research or sort of sometimes even kind of making educated bridges across the two things that you do know. But for the purpose of this book, it came back to me, and too much. I had to start sort of throwing a lot of it away.
Yeah, and with that journal from the 18-year-old Chris, perhaps the sequel will find some interesting ways.
That's already written, yeah.
Brilliant. We have one comment from Judith, which reads, "My 5 children," that's in inverted commas, "are all in their 20s now, and they're all getting your book for Christmas. It's always a good time and age to understand experiences like yours. Though I wish I could have given them that book 10 years ago."
Yeah, oh, that's really nice, Judith. Thank you.
Brilliant. I've also been told that Brian has a question. I apologize. I can't see a hand, but I will take this on good faith that Brian has a question, and I will unmute you. Are you there, Brian?
I am indeed, yeah.
Hey, Brian.
Well done, Chris. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I don't know whether we should say Happy Publication Day, but I'm sure you know what I mean. However, my question is this: we're both involved in the writing of creative non-fiction, so we both write about other people, and you've touched to whom we owe a duty of care, which of course you've touched upon. But what duty of care did you afford yourself?
In terms of the way that I'm represented, and what people might think of me.
Yes, but also we're always very aware that when you're writing about real people, that there's going to be an effect. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
And you have to, in some way, litigate against that.
Yeah.
How did you prevent?
I'm not sure.
Undue hurt to yourself.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether I failed to do that. In complete honesty, I don't think I thought about that enough. I know I say when teaching creative nonfiction that you mustn't sort of push it if you don't want to write something. If you're sort of feeling yourself going into territory that's hard, if you feel yourself starting to approach something maybe traumatic or something that's digging up something that you'd rather not think about. And, for some people that can be a great experience and a really sort of freeing, liberating experience, but for some people it can be really horrible. So I always say, if you start feeling that way, don't do it. Maybe I say that because I didn't afford myself that care whilst writing this. And maybe that's what makes me think about that now. I think I just took a nosedive into it. I think once the words were flowing and I was starting to sort of get a grip on sort of writing a lot at a time, it wasn't difficult to write anymore. I was sort of splurging a lot of it out. I don't think I really stopped much to think about whether it was healthy or not. So like I said earlier on, I don't know whether it contributed to me getting sort of more ill throughout the years that I was writing this. But I don't think I was particularly paying myself much care while I was writing it. I was just getting the work done. I just had the vision of the book and the PhD in mind. And I suppose I was thinking more about what this could do to help people. And I was like trying to get there, trying to sort of picture this kind of almost the day that we're at now of where other people would be able to read it and hopefully benefit from it. And in reality, maybe I should have stopped. I not stopped, but I hear other authors who say, "Oh, I'm currently writing 4 things. I've got a novel that I'm doing some sort of short stories here. I'm doing a piece of nonfiction there." I think Martin would often say, when we would be having our supervision sessions, he'd sort of say, "Why don't you just spend a few weeks writing some short story? Like, you used to love writing fiction. Why don't you write something entirely different for a little while?" And I never did. I was just my head was too much in this book. And so I think the answer is, I don't think I did.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that full and intelligent and eloquent answer. I tell my students, particularly when they write non-fiction, I quote Robert Burns and say that if only we had the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us, and you've clearly done that. You've let people see yourself as others saw you. Well done, man. Well done, son. Well done.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
A brilliant question there, Brian. And as you said, a fantastic answer there, Chris, as well. I realized that what I suspect I did was forget that real life hands exist and was just very much focusing on the digital. So I suspect at this stage, I'm going to open up my view and look at all of your
I
wonderful.
couldn't find the digital hand, so I had to get a piece of paper and wave it.
Well, thank you as well to David for sort of pointing me in that direction. I just stared at Chris's face for another 20 minutes myself, so thank you for pointing that out.
Thanks,
Given the time, I think we perhaps have time for perhaps one more question, if anybody has one. Now, feel free to raise a digital or a very real hand. I'm now looking at you and scrolling through our pages. So if you do have a further question, please let me know. And those of you who are softly moving your hands in non-hand putting up ways, that's not fair. Oh, a question in the chat. Excellent. I know how to deal with those ones. Brilliant. So this is a question from Veronique. At last, a few years after writing this book, do you feel it was cathartic or therapeutic?
I think it was cathartic. Was it therapeutic? No. Was it cathartic? Yes. I think, yeah, as I said, it helped lay to rest a lot of the stuff that was happening at the time. It stopped it from playing on my mind as much, and I think that's something that you can only achieve by kind of a cathartic experience and digging back into something like that. So I would definitely say that it had that effect on me. So yeah, it's a good question.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for your questions, and thank you, Chris, for answering them. I think this would be a fantastic time to direct you all to the chat, where you will see in just a moment appear the link for you all to click on to buy Chris's book, to share it with your friends and family for Christmas, and to sort of experience that sense of catharsis for yourself. I myself have read this book, and I've read it a couple of times actually over the last couple of weeks. I find it very difficult to come up with questions whilst reading it, because I had to keep reminding myself, you're not just reading this because you want to read a book, you're reading this because you're going to talk to Chris about it. The immersive nature of the sort of experience of this has caught me off guard more than once, and I can firmly recommend it to all of you. As I mentioned at the start, this is going to be the end of our sort of official conversation, if you like. This is the end of the recording as well. So I would like to thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks as well for everybody who asked a question, whether it's sort of verbally or written down. And I also want to put on extremely very much my thanks on the record here for, of course, Martin, Alice, the University of Hull, and of course, Chris, our excellent interviewee for this evening. The conversation will continue a little bit from here, but you are now free to sort of exit the room stage left if you would like. Consider the next 10 minutes the digital version of grabbing a glass of water or wine or any other alliterative drink beginning with W, sitting around a table as the event is packed away around you. I'll be sort of folding tables in the background if you like. I say, do remember that the Fear Talking is available through the link that I've posted in the chat for you. I say it's an experience I'd recommend to all of you. I know there are a lot of students and a lot of writers here. It's something that I think no matter what you want to write, you'll learn so much about technique, you'll learn so much about style, you'll learn so much about honesty, and you'll learn so much about what it actually is to be a human. And again, that's only from a couple of read-throughs that I've done already. If you are looking for further events, then you are in luck, because on December the 16th at 6:30 p.m, HU Writes, which is our in-house student-led writing group, are putting on a showcase of creative work. It's titled Trickling Through Time. If you'd like to attend, the digital event is open to everybody. To book a seat, much like you did for our event this evening, please just send an email to tricklingthroughtime@gmail.com, and I will